Judy's Magic Cast-On is often used as a closed circular cast-on for working in the round, such as working socks from the toe up. It can also be used when knitting flat and working in both directions at the same time, as for working this border right here. In this scarf, the central cabled section was knit first and the ribbing was added later. So it was knit by starting at this point and working out, adding increases in between as I went. So I started with Judy's Magic Cast-On here and then worked in those two directions at the same time. To work the cast-on, you need a circular needle. I've got one here that's 32 inches long. And you need your working yarn. Since we're working in both directions at the same time, we can only do this with a small number of stitches, so we don't need much yarn tail. The way you get set up is you take the yarn tail, you bring it over your left thumb and forefinger from front to back, and you let the tail hang down the back. Again, we're only going to be casting on 6 stitches, so 3 stitches will be cast on using the tail yarn and 3 stitches using the working yarn, so we don't need much of a tail in this particular use of the cast on. Once you have the yarn over your fingers, you hold both strands against the palm of your hand to create some tension. We're going to put loops on both needles. We're going to alternate between the top needle and the bottom needle. And so the first stitch is going to go on the top needle, and we do that simply by slipping the yarn between the 2 needles so that it strands over the top needle. So now, because we're alternating, we're going to put the next loop on the lower needle. And the way we do that is that we use the upper yarn to put loops on the lower needle and the lower yarn to put loops on the upper needle. So since we need to put one on the lower needle, we're going to bring the upper yarn down below the lower needle and then up in between the 2 needles to get the loop on. Now we need to put one on the upper needle, and we're going to use the lower yarn. So again, we come around the needle from underneath it, so we need to start between these 2 needles. We get the yarn between them and then bring it over the top. And you see how my hand is kind of twisting when I'm doing this, and I bring it back into position. Now I have 2 on the top and 1 on the bottom. That means I need to use the upper yarn to put the loop on the lower needle. It comes below and then between the 2 needles. So now I have 2 on each. Now I need to put one on the upper needle, so I use the lower yarn. I come up between the 2 needles and over the top of the upper needle. And then I need to complete it by putting the 3rd stitch on the lower needle. So I bring the upper yarn below it and in between. And for this use of Judy's Magic Cast-On, I've completed getting the loops on the needle. If you haven't used this cast-on before, then you should practice so that your hands get the muscle memory and you really understand what you're doing. Then you can move on to working the first 2 rows flat in part 2. So now that you have your stitches on the needle, we're going to rotate the needles. They're pointing left now. We need to rotate them so that they point right. And you'll see we've got 2 strands of yarn here still. We've got the working yarn, which is the long yarn, and then we've got the tail yarn. And the tail yarn is just kind of looped over this top needle. We need to get it out of the way, and we need to provide some tension on it so that it can actually be knit, because we're going to be working that stitch first and it's just a loop of yarn. So we're going to pull it over to the side and hold on to it against these needles. And then we're going to pull the lower needle out because we're going to use that needle to knit with. So we pull the lower needle out. Now we're ready to knit. So you need to tension the yarn around whichever hand you use to knit. I use my left hand, so I gotta keep that tail pinched while I get my left hand ready. So I've still got that tail pinched against the needle. So now I'm going to work across these stitches. Now if you've used this cast on before to start a sock toe, you'll see that this is not the same that you would do it if you were knitting a sock toe. You'd have these purl stitches up to the top and you'd be knitting differently. So we're knitting flat. We want the knit side, the smooth side, facing us. There are little purl bumps on the back side. We're just going to knit across all 3 of these stitches. 1, 2, 3. At this point we can let go of the tail. We don't need it anymore. So anytime you work across a flat row, you have to go across all of the stitches. We've got them on 2 needles. So we've worked across the first 3, now we need to work across the second 3. We do that by once again arranging the needles so that they point to the right. We've got one that's floppy though. And the floppy one is the one that was used. Oh, this is all wrapped around here. Get that out of the way. So this was the loose needle. We're going to put the stitches onto that needle. And again, we're going to pull the lower needle out. You can tell if you have the correct needle because the working yarn is always attached to the last stitch that was worked, and it's attached to this one that's on the cable. So now we're going to work across these 3 stitches. So once again, tension the yarn however you need to and whichever hand you need to in order to work across these 3 stitches. Oh, something happened there. I split that stitch. There we go. Okay, so now we have completed the first row. That one looks a little ragged. This one looks a little ragged. The stockinette side is facing, and now we need to purl across. And so with flat knitting, the last stitch of one row is always the first stitch that's knit on the next row. So we're going to turn this way, but now we're going to purl across these 3 stitches that we just finished up with. So now we've worked across these 3, now we need to work across the 3 that are on the cable. So once again, you rotate the needles so they're pointing to the right, and the loose cable gets put back up on to the stitches. And the working yarn, once again, it's attached to the last stitch that was worked, which is down here. So now we have to work these 3. So you tension the working yarn around the fingers. They're required. So now we've completed them. And now, so here's the stockinette side. I'm pulling that tail a little bit. And we have enough of a strip that these 6 stitches can all sit together on the needle. So I just pull on it so I get them all on the cable. And since we just completed a purl row, the next one is going to be a knit row. So these stitches are going to form the border. So these 3 are going to be the left border and these 3 are going to be the right border. And as we work across, we're going to be putting increases in between here. So gradually things will get wider, just like they would for right here.